Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar, the very first event in RSK's energy transmission campaign. And we're very excited to have the opportunity to do the first webinar for you. We're going to be talking about how to deliver the benefits of biodiversity through the delivery of energy transmission infrastructure. And before I introduce myself and indeed the team for today, I'm going to go through the standard housekeeping rules that we have on these GoToWebinars. So those people dialing in, we can't hear you, I'm afraid, but we will be able to hear your voice through the Q&A. So if you have any questions as we go through, do please pop those questions into the Q&A boxes and we'll sift through those. Hopefully we'll have about 10-15 minutes at the end of this hour to go through your questions. If you have other things to raise, there will be a feedback form coming about an hour after the presentation. Do pop in there any ideas for other events you'd like to see through the Creating a Buzz energy campaign. Also, we'd be interested to know if you could tell us any challenges you see through energy infrastructure, what challenges you have in delivering it. It doesn't have to be about biodiversity. Yes, I know today is about that, but it can be about anything. We'll do our level best to respond to those. Right, so you have a glut of speakers today, all three of them. So my name is Jon Davies. I'm a technical director at RSK Wilding. So I set up the team about 5 years ago to deliver biodiversity net gains. So that is our main focus. And within my team, I have Catherine Skinner, who focuses a lot on energy transmission infrastructure, hence being here today, and she'll talk a bit more later about National Grid and the work we do for National Grid. And Simon is involved with projects in Africa mainly, so he's going to bring more of an internationalist perspective to transmission projects and how we can deal with biodiversity internationally. I will ask you both to pop your cameras off for the time being, if that's okay, and I will do the same. And then we will press on with the presentation, if that's okay. Right, so what we're going to cover today. So this is very much about how we can use the projects we work on to deliver benefits for biodiversity. Very quickly, I'll explain what biodiversity is. I'm sure everyone knows. The key thing is how can energy transmission infrastructure affect biodiversity adversely? What can we do to minimize those impacts and ultimately deliver a gain for biodiversity? How we do that in the UK or in England specifically through something called biodiversity net gain, which we will explain. And then I will hand over to Catherine to give a case study of how we deal with BNG with our National Grid work at scale. And then, as I said, Simon will talk about the similar sort of approach that we have, but in Africa. So a couple of case studies for you, and then we'll have, as I say, the Q&A at the end. So who are we? RSK Wilding is my team. So we've got about 25 people in my team. We focus on biodiversity net gain and habitat restoration, working with a wide variety of clients, not only in the energy sector. And we're basically all about restoring nature from small scale to very large scale. We are within biosensors. So RSK Biosensors is an ecological consultancy of about 250 ecologists. And biosensors deal with, in a sense, the kind of the front end of this. So biosensors will do the ecological surveys for large scale infrastructure projects and the impact assessments. And Wilding tends to come in once biodiversity net gain becomes an issue that needs to be discussed. And as I say, Wilding sits within biosensors. So we are in a bit of a crisis, as I'm sure many of you will be aware. Biodiversity, there are infinite definitions, but essentially when we're dealing with it, it's easiest just to think of it as habitats and species. And whilst the decline in habitats and species is something we don't want to see for kind of ethical reasons, it's also rather more fundamental than that. We need biodiversity to thrive. It provides us with a wealth of ecosystem services I'm sure you're all familiar with. So this is, you may have seen the, what was it? The oh crumbs, I can't remember what it's called. The government came up with a report that showed how important it was for national security. That was it. Biodiversity and national security is key. So this really is something that could be a threat to us going forward. So we should do what we can to reverse the biodiversity loss that we see. Now, the majority of biodiversity loss is unfortunately anthropogenic, so it's down to us. The elephant in the room is really agriculture. I do feel development gets a bit of a hard rap because agriculture, if you fly over this planet, you'll see how much of the land is taken up with agriculture. It's the footprint of development is relatively small in comparison. But we work in development and we have an opportunity to do stuff through our work. So that's really what we're talking about today. Now, energy transmission and the energy sector is clearly doing beneficial stuff for both the climate and biodiversity by providing us with renewable energy. So that's clearly a benefit. But it is worth noting that when you implement these renewable energy infrastructure projects, whether it is solar farms or wind farms or the transmission projects themselves, if you do that poorly, that can have an adverse effect through loss of habitats and impacts on species. So we have an opportunity through delivering this sort of work and doing it properly to target the mitigation, the compensation, and offsetting allied to the work we do specifically to deliver a gain for biodiversity. And that's what we're trying to encourage everyone to do on this project, or on this webinar, pardon me, and to show how that can be done. So I think the message I want to get across is that for everyone who works on these sorts of projects, we can all do our bit for biodiversity, basically. So how do transmission projects adversely affect biodiversity? So the most obvious route is through habitat loss. So if you look at that picture in the top right-hand corner, that's a cable route. And for most linear transmission projects, you will have quite a big working width that needs to get cleared, maybe 40 or 50 meters wide. And obviously, if you're going through quite nice habitat, then that will lead to a sometimes permanent loss or at least a temporary loss. In most cases, when you're putting cables underground, for example, that's going to be a temporary loss because you'll fill back in over the trench. But it'll take a while, obviously, if you have forest that has been cut down in order to implement this, then obviously it'll take a while for that to reinstate. There's also fragmentation impacts with linear schemes. If you imagine there's animals on this side of this scrubby woodland that want to get across over there and routinely used to before this great big working width was there, they will be dissuaded from doing so, especially if they're not very happy about going across open, muddy ground. So that fragmentation effect is important, something we need to be aware of. There's also hydrological impacts we need to be aware of. So if you're putting a trench or a tunnel through a peatland or another kind of a damp grassland or a wet habitat of some sort, then putting that trench in is creating a drain, essentially, that will draw water out of the habitat and dry it out. And that can have very long-term adverse effects on habitats that kind of rely on having a sensitive hydrological regime. So that is something we need to be aware of through our projects. Also, you've got a very kind of wide, muddy swathe in this top picture. If you had a watercourse nearby, obviously there's a real risk of sediment and silt getting into the watercourses, which can have an adverse effect, of course. Also pollutants like diesel spills and what have you. So we need to be aware of those. During the construction phase, there may be noise impacts on sensitive neighboring habitats and species. And then there's the potential risk of bird strike and other impacts, visual impacts of overhead lines and towers. So that rather gruesome picture of a white stork that's being caught on overhead lines in Europe. So that kind of impact on birds is a permanent impact of overhead lines. So these are all the kind of ways that we see biodiversity adversely being affected. But the good news, I guess, for the industry we work in is that you can largely avoid these impacts because with linear infrastructure in particular, you have the ability to route around the most sensitive habitats. And so I worked on the options appraisal guidance for National Grid in the UK about 15 years ago, which was really geared towards how you can minimize impacts in this way by careful route alignment. And you can avoid most of the impacts that way. If there are any impacts left, so you can't, for whatever reason, avoid a certain habitat, then you can mitigate the impacts by sensitive design. So maybe reduce the working width, for example, or change the way you deliver the project. And if after all of that you still end up with some residual impacts, then you can compensate for those through offsetting, which we'll talk about in a second. Now, in England, this kind of process of understanding what the impacts on biodiversity are and reversing them, in other words, leading to a benefit for biodiversity, is called biodiversity net gain, or BNG. So what is this, and how does it apply to energy transmission? So the biodiversity net gain, I won't read out that definition up there, but essentially it's allowing development, giving the development the ability to end up with a net gain for biodiversity through careful design and through offsetting. If you look at the chart on the right, the kind of conventional way we've done things for decades is basically you've got some habitat, someone comes in with a digger, builds something, and that ends up with a net loss. And that's partly why we're in the pickle we're in at the moment, frankly, as far as biodiversity is concerned. Now, no net loss has been a thing for a few years, where you do the same sort of thing, but you kind of offset it. You create like-for-like replacement of habitat, but it's pretty much the same as was before. So that's no net loss. The thing about net gain is you build in biodiversity enhancements into your developments. So that's what the green in this graphic is, and then you have additional offsetting done as well, and all designed to come up with a net increase in biodiversity. Now, this was mandated in England by the Environment Act in 2021, came into force for planning developments in 2024, and we're hoping that BNG is going to come into play for NSIPs, so nationally significant infrastructure projects, which of course most large-scale energy transmission will be, in May of this year. And BNG requires a minimum of 10% to be delivered. This can be delivered through a combination of on-site and or off-site. Obviously, if you can deliver 10% on-site, then you don't have to pay for offsets. And all of this is done through a kind of a consistent methodology, which is called the statutory biodiversity metric. And that is a spreadsheet, basically, that allows us to measure losses and gains. And the net gain, as I say, often requires off-site measures. And this offsetting we generally provide through either existing habitat banks, that's land that's been basically turned by the landowner from something that's low in biodiversity, like arable land or modified grassland, into something like species-rich grassland or meadow or species-rich woodland, whatever it is. And so they then sell that uplift that they've created to developers as biodiversity credits. The alternative, and this applies quite well to bigger schemes, is to create bespoke biodiversity offsets. You know the habitats that you need because you've got a big project that's having such and such an effect. This is something that we do in our team. You can go and buy land, create the habitat you need, and that's can be a more cost-effective way of doing it when you've got quite a large demand for units. And the other benefit of that approach is that as a developer, it's your offset. So with habitat banks, you're almost like paying an environmental tax to a habitat bank. You're buying credits, that's meeting your 10% need, but an offset that is your offset allows you not only to deliver the BNG you need, but also for us to co-design that scheme with you to have other environmental and socio-economic benefits. So it might be that we're creating wetland habitat to protect downstream habitats or to hold back floodwater. It might be that we're creating nice habitats near to a town, so you've got public access to nature, all these sorts of things. So there are kind of benefits around that as well. For those who are unfamiliar with the process, I'm going to skip through this very quickly just to give you a sense of what it involves. As ecologists, we would work on a scheme with a red line boundary. Here it's a footprint development rather than a linear scheme. We'd have a red line boundary where the proposed development is going to take place. And what we do is we map the habitat. So we've always done this as ecologists, but there is a relatively new system called the UK Habitat Classification System, or UK HAB, and we would map the habitats within the footprint using that system. And each of these colors is a different habitat type. You can see there is the area. This gets mapped in GIS, so it's very accurate representation of the area. This orange is reed bed, open water is the blue, the red is open mosaic habitat, the green here is grassland, and the dark green down the bottom is woodland. So you get a sense, you get a mix of habitats on the site like this. And what happens is that you then put that information into this statutory biodiversity metric. And each of these different habitats has a different value. So reed bed is quite high value, as is, well, all of the habitats here are actually quite high value. But there are others like arable land or modified grassland that are lower value. And we call this distinctiveness. So what the metric does, it multiplies the area of the habitat by its distinctiveness or its nature conservation value, but also by its condition. Is it in poor condition, moderate condition, good condition? And then the metric kind of spits out the results of what the baseline biodiversity on your site is. And that's called biodiversity units. And we split those into habitat areas, but also we can include hedgerows, so linear terrestrial features, and also linear aquatic features like watercourses. So those three things get looked at separately. So once you know as a developer what the baseline is within your scheme red line boundary, then you can go about designing your scheme. And of course, we would encourage you as ecologists to minimize the impact by putting your construction footprint where the lower quality habitats are. In this case, rather difficult because they're all pretty nice. But the idea is that you reduce the offsetting burden by not losing the more valuable habitats. So in this example, we had this, as I say, it was a film studios. They took up like the northern half of the site. And it allowed us to at least do something with the retained habitats in the south of the site, because you can uplift biodiversity in retained habitats, perhaps changing it from poor condition to good condition, for example, will give you biodiversity units. In this case, because it's such a nice site, they actually ended up with a massive offsetting burden of about 430 units, which is very big. But you can go through that process iteratively to try and reduce that offsetting burden. And then what the metric does is it calculates the post-development biodiversity. So obviously, if you're losing habitat under here, then that's a negative. And it calculates the change. So it's the post-development biodiversity units minus the baseline will give you the net change. Now, in this particular example, it ended up being a minus 35% situation, which is not very good, largely because it's very difficult to get a net gain on site. And so this went to planning. And in B&G, you produce what's called a B&G design stage report, which sets out the B&G situation for your development. It went to planning with a negative 35% and didn't go through planning, funnily enough. So we then worked with the developer to come up with an offsetting strategy that delivered 10% net gain. So it got to a 10% plus as opposed to a minus 35, and we got it through planning committee. So that's kind of the process and how it works. And what that illustrates to you is it's very difficult to deliver a 10% net gain on site when you're kind of wiping out half of the site. So it's often difficult to do that. And there are ways to offset and to get up to that 10%. A lot of local authorities that we're talking, local planning authorities, have land, and we're talking to them about how they can use that land and uplift the biodiversity to basically create habitat banks on their land. So as a developer, you can buy units or biodiversity credits from local authorities. There are a whole bunch of private suppliers doing this as well, so creating habitat banks around England, again, where they own land, they are converting it from low biodiversity to high biodiversity and selling the uplift. And then, as I said previously, you could create bespoke offsets as well when you have a particularly high demand. And then the last resort is buying credits from Natural England. And that is the last resort because they're essentially deliberately pricing themselves out of the market because they want the B&G market, the private market, to really take over and kind of run this system, which it is doing at the moment, which is good. Now, every offset, whether it's a habitat bank or a bespoke offset, you're basically delivering this uplift, and you need to have that approved. You need to demonstrate that you are going to do what you're proposing to do, and so you have to go through the process of getting this registered on a national gain site register, it's called. And in order to get on that register, you need a legal agreement between the landowner who's proposing to make this uplift and the responsible body, which is the regulator, which I'll talk about in a second. And this is a 30-year legal agreement. So this isn't short term. It's you're committing quite a lot if you're doing this as a landowner. So it's not for the faint-hearted. And as I say, you need to demonstrate an uplift is being achieved over those 30 years. So the responsible body, which we are as RSK Biosensors and the Wilding team in particular, we deliver that role for other habitat banks. So we are going to be monitoring. We've got dozens of habitat banks already that we're working with, and we will be monitoring all of those sites to make sure that they're delivering the uplift that they say they are. And it's worth, as someone wanting to create habitat banks, you need to understand the risks and the costs associated with it. It's not a small undertaking, and if you can't deliver the habitats you're saying you're going to, then as a responsible body, we can make sure that you do. So we have enforcement powers. And so what we do here in RSK, in particular with our kind of major infrastructure projects, is we have this kind of triumvirate axis of excellence rather than axis of evil. And so we have biosensors at the front end, as I said. So that's the kind of ecological consultancy part of this. We routinely do the survey work and impact assessment for large infrastructure projects. And at that early stage, we'll start thinking about the biodiversity net gain implications of a big scheme. The sooner you think about it, the better. And if you can think about bespoke offsetting, especially if it's a big scheme, then the sooner you can start thinking about that, the better. And that's really where Wilding starts to come in. That's our forte. That's that kind of designing schemes to reduce the offsetting burden, but also thinking about offsetting nice and early. That's where we come in. And then the sort of final delivery side is delivered by Nature Repair. So we've got a kind of a newish company that delivers all of that at scale. And that's where the purchasing of land, the delivering of the habitat creation and long-term management comes in. So it's kind of an end-to-end delivery that we've got right from the start of you thinking about what a transmission project will look like, all the way through to delivering the net gain for you on the ground. And this addressing BNG early through bespoke offsetting, if it's a big scheme, is important because it increases the likelihood of you getting consent. If the consenting authority knows that you've got a really good cogent plan for how you're going to deliver your BNG cost effectively with these other kind of ecosystem benefits that I was talking about earlier, then you're really going to, you're much more likely to sail through the planning system. And very quickly, the BNG in the UK more broadly. So BNG is only mandatory in England. So in Wales, we have something called net benefits for biodiversity, which is more of a qualitative assessment rather than the quantitative one using that statutory biodiversity metric. In Scotland, they're delivering a similar sort of process through the national planning framework up there. They are looking at a metric themselves. And Northern Ireland, at the moment, it's not formal legislation, but they are also looking as well. So it is the way forward. And not just in the UK, other countries around the world are showing interest. I've talked to people in America and Romania about this. So people are seeing this as a very progressive form of legislation. And there is other legislation around the world, like the Nature Repair Act in Australia, for example. So this is being seen as a way that development can do its bit to reverse biodiversity loss. And it's not just development. All corporate activities and all corporate bodies are being encouraged to contribute to helping biodiversity through things like ESG, so environment, sustainability and governance, or the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures, TNFD. So basically, in order to get investment money into your company for whatever you're wanting to do, by demonstrating the positive stuff you're doing for biodiversity, that's how you can access that investment. So we're going in the right direction, I think, hopefully. So it's looking quite positive. Right, that's quite enough from me. I will now hand over to Catherine, who will go through national grid work. Over to you, Catherine.
Brilliant, thank you, John. So for anybody on the call that might be slightly less familiar with National Grid, they own, maintain and develop the high voltage electricity transmission network in England and Wales, as well as acting as a distribution network operator. And at present, the most significant programme of work being undertaken is the Great Grid Upgrade, which aims to increase capacity within the electricity grid. Now, although these projects are typically deemed to be nationally significant infrastructure projects, or NSIPs, and therefore are not currently subject to mandatory BNG requirements, there is typically an expectation for some degree of BNG delivery to be provided, and National Grid themselves have committed to delivering 10% BNG on new major projects and select primary and grid substation sites. So as Jon's been mentioning, across RSK Biocensus and Wilding, we regularly provide services for the full suite of ecological surveys, assessments and reporting that are necessary to support the delivery and maintenance of energy transmission infrastructure. And the increasing focus on BNG has also introduced several new elements to this suite of services. This includes BNG assessments, the design, management and monitoring of BNG measures, acting as BNG technical advisors, and acting in a BNG critical friend role, supporting organisations to incorporate BNG into their long-term plans in a strategic manner. And it's our experience and learning from acting in this BNG technical advisor role that I'm going to be exploring in a bit more detail within the case study. So firstly, I just wanted to familiarise you with what we see that BNG technical advisor role being. At an overarching level, the aim of the role is to have regular and direct contact with the client in order to provide consistent technical advice and support as they progress through the delivery of their BNG requirements. The exact scope of the role may vary depending on the nature of the project and the point at which this role is appointed. So this list shown is far from comprehensive, but we would typically expect it to include things like the assessment of project impacts, which might range from data collection, assessing work impacts, and undertaking BNG calculations on an iterative basis throughout the design process. We'll engage with regulatory bodies, something that's of particular importance at present, given the absence of those mandatory requirements or guidance for NSIPs. And this means that it's vital to have agreed targets and a consistent understanding of the approach that's going to be used to achieve these. We'll provide support to other project disciplines. And this is important because the scale of BNG requirements can be impacted by a wide range of activities, not all of which might immediately think to consider BNG. So by working with other project disciplines, you can ensure suitable consideration and incorporation of BNG across a project. We'll also help to identify and design on-site BNG measures and support in the delivery of these. And where BNG targets can't be met within the footprint of a project, something that can be a regular occurrence for projects of this nature and scale, the role can also include helping to identify suitable off-site providers and provide support throughout the purchasing process. Next slide, please, Jon. So from acting in this role across a number of projects, we've been able to see some of the key challenges that face the sector as it begins to incorporate this new mechanism for biodiversity delivery, as well as the valuable opportunities it offers. And while we've identified these through the BNG process, much of what I'm going to talk about is going to be relevant to the delivery of other wider long-term biodiversity policies and actions, as well as to developments that fall outside of the energy sector. So one of the main considerations is that BNG, as we've mentioned several times, is not currently mandatory for NSIPs. And this means there's no NSIP-specific guidance available for how BNG should be delivered on large-scale projects. And although there is a range of guidance available to support the developments that are currently subject to mandatory BNG, this guidance doesn't always scale up very effectively. As a result, each project can be subject to distinctly different requirements in the scale of net gain required, as well as in relation to any reporting and delivery expectations. This risks causing confusion between projects, for example, in situations where an approach may be acceptable on one project and not on another, and makes it difficult for clear and consistent advice to be provided. Now, as Jon said, BNG for NSIPs is currently due to come into force in May of 2026, and obviously should be supported by guidance on its application. And this will hopefully smooth the process for any new NSIPs that occur post-May. However, there's still going to be learning as this process is implemented, so supporting the national guidance with clear internal processes that allow for that consistent application of guidance across an organisation is likely to be beneficial. Next are the timescales involved, which can be a consideration on a number of fronts. And this includes the timeframes over which these projects are delivered, which may result in notable delays between impacts occurring and BNG measures being able to be implemented. The comparative timing of funding periods, which might be much shorter in duration than the period of time over which BNG needs to be considered. And this may be of a particular issue where an organisation is retaining responsibility for some or all of the habitat management and monitoring, as it may make it difficult to ensure that the necessary long-term funds are going to be available right from an early stage in the project. Another consideration is that the duration of BNG management and monitoring requirements, which at 30 years is considerably longer than most historic landscape or habitat management commitments, and may raise concerns about associated risks. And finally, both during the project and throughout the subsequent 30-year period of BNG management and monitoring, there are naturally going to be considerable changes in delivery partners, consultants, and internal staff, risking misunderstandings or a loss of information. Now, some of these elements are going to be out of the hands of an organisation. However, actions can be taken to manage the potentially significant personnel changes that might occur by ensuring there's a clear process in place to enable these transitions. This might include records of conversations and agreements around requirements and delivery approaches, maintaining logs of design changes, associated BNG metric iterations and assumptions, and details of each party's roles and responsibilities, effectively a BNG form of the golden thread process used in construction. This will aid any handover processes and minimise the risk of information being lost or misinterpreted within a project. In addition, where these changes can be foreseen, such as where a project moves between an internal delivery and operational team, it's valuable to allow for an elongated handover period to ensure that that new team can fully understand the commitments that have been made, the nature of their responsibilities going forward, and when actions will need to be taken. Meanwhile, at the organisational level, BNG-focused teams can provide support to individual projects where required and encourage a consistent approach to its application. And this is all tied into the next point, which is around internal processes. As BNG is a comparatively new requirement, there may be a need for existing processes to be reviewed and updated to appropriately incorporate it. Achieving this may be impacted by the varying levels of knowledge and understanding in relation to the requirements and delivery mechanisms involved in BNG. Upskilling, therefore, is key to the successful implementation not only of BNG, but also any other biodiversity-based policies at the organisational level. In the case of BNG, although it's a habitat-based requirement, the delivery of it can require involvement from a wide and disparate array of teams, including procurement and legal. So this means that BNG knowledge is not only required by those that are considering the ecology or landscaping of a project, but also for many internal teams that might only be tangentially associated with an individual project. By ensuring these teams have got a good understanding of how their specific activities may be affected by, can contribute towards, or might be required to support BNG, it will enable a more efficient process, improve communications, and a better understanding and therefore management of any risks involved. The scale of energy transmission projects can be one of the biggest challenges to effective BNG delivery, increasing the time, cost, and complexity of baseline data collection and associated BNG calculations, as well as the resulting scale of BNG requirements, which may be difficult to secure on-site or via a single off-site provider. And this process may be compounded by the fact that, unlike other forms of development, opportunities to select between locations for development are more limited with energy transmission projects, where there may need to be a set start or end point, and where there is likely to be a need to incorporate elements of existing infrastructure. However, early assessment of the baseline biodiversity value will support the effective application of the mitigation hierarchy during the design process and pay dividends in the long term by ensuring that micrositing decisions take BNG into consideration. And this can enable the targeted avoidance of those high-value habitats Jon was speaking about earlier, in turn reducing BNG delivery requirements and the associated costs. Collecting the data needed for BNG assessments or long-term monitoring for these large-scale projects can be time-consuming and expensive. So to a certain extent, that can't be avoided, but there are increasingly technologies that can be considered to support this work, such as remote sensing, which can be used to support the collection of habitat data. And while there are limitations to processes such as this, which means it's unlikely to remove the need for on-the-ground surveys, its application can make these surveys much more efficient through pre-mapping of a site, thereby reducing the time that's needed on-site, something that may be particularly cost-effective when applied at a large scale. Finally, land ownership can be a significant consideration on large-scale energy transmission projects, where often very little land within the order limits is owned or even held under lease, instead crossing through many different landowners. This might make it difficult or unfeasible to implement biodiversity measures that can be reliably maintained and monitored over the long term. And even where the land is owned, careful consideration may still need to be given to its suitability for BNG, for example, in case that land may be required for future operational purposes, because the delivery of these biodiversity benefits might prevent other uses of that land, in the case of BNG, for at least 30 years. However, having said all of that, BNG on NSIPs can also offer some of the greatest opportunities to deliver biodiversity benefits. Historically, actions that benefit biodiversity have been considered on a per-project basis. However, BNG can provide an opportunity to think about this beyond this and consider strategic approaches. For example, where forward programs of work are known, it provides an opportunity to consider the requirements that might arise from clusters of projects. These requirements could be offset collectively, allowing for more cost-effective, large-scale delivery that can provide greater biodiversity benefits. Now, doing so may require a bespoke offset, working with technical experts to create exactly what's needed for a project or area, rather than purchasing biodiversity units off the shelf. On large-scale projects, bespoke landscape scale offsets may be considerably more cost-effective and also provide an organisation with a personal habitat bank where they can directly see the biodiversity, wider environmental and even societal benefits delivered. And this doesn't necessarily require the organisation in question to take on long-term responsibilities or the associated risks of land ownership, which can often be a key concern, depending, of course, on the nature of any agreements made. An action of this nature shouldn't, however, detract from achieving as much biodiversity benefit within a project's footprint as possible, in line with the mitigation hierarchy. Even where only small pockets of habitat creation are possible, close examination of planting specifications to remove or at least minimise the use of non-native species or the avoidance of agricultural cultivars within seed mixes can all benefit the end results. Consideration can also be given to how these areas may be managed in the long term, moving away from more amenity-style processes to actions that will better support biodiversity. Finally, by considering local plans and policies within habitat and on-site landscaping designs, these measures may be able to support wider landscape scale targets and objectives. Next slide, please, John. So to finish off, I just wanted to show an example of how B&G measures could come together to deliver not only on the B&G side, but wider environmental and societal benefits for energy transmission projects. So in this case, we've got an exemplar substation. Here, the targeted location of woodland planting can connect up two areas of currently disconnected woodland and provide opportunities for carbon sequestration. The potential of existing areas of wet ground can be maximised by undertaking wetland creation, providing valuable habitat for biodiversity, sequestering carbon and providing flood management in the form of water retention, something that may mitigate some of the risks to the substation itself. The creation of biodiverse habitats, however, doesn't always have to involve extensive interventions. In some cases, habitats can be left to develop naturally, for example here, allowing a species-rich mosaic of bare ground, grassland and scrub to develop for a cost-effective and low-maintenance biodiversity intervention. Lastly, where soils are suitable, species-rich grasslands can be created, which offer opportunities for local people and staff to gain access to nature. So with that, I will pass on to Simon to talk about some of the work he's been involved in delivering biodiversity enhancements in Africa.
Great stuff. Thanks, Catherine. Over to you, Simon.
Thank you both. Good afternoon, everyone. John and Catherine have done a great job talking about the potential impacts associated with energy infrastructure projects, the mitigation hierarchy, no net loss and net gain provided at scale, which makes my life a lot easier because it means I can just focus on the nice and happy biodiversity benefits we've been providing on a couple of projects in Africa. So RSK Group, especially RSK Africa, the International Projects Group, and RSK Biosensors has worked on a range of energy infrastructure projects across Africa. And when we're talking about enhancements and benefits, I should say and reiterate what John said, that this is done following the application of the mitigation hierarchy. So once those impacts have been either avoided or minimized to the extent possible, then we start looking at offsets and enhancements. So we help our clients to achieve no net loss and net gain as required. When looking at the international lender requirements, whether it's a net loss or a net gain, often depends on the types of habitat you're working in. And when it comes to quantitative or qualitative in offsets, depends whether you have residual impacts or not. If you've got residual impacts, so those impacts remaining after the application of the hierarchy, then these normally need to be offset by quantitative, more tangible measures. However, if you've managed to avoid all those impacts, there's no residual impacts left, but you're still wanting and needing to deliver again, then some of those measures can be more qualitative, which in this context can mean things like education programs, awareness raising, or supporting further studies and surveys. So numerous biodiversity benefits have been provided on the projects. Importantly, these have all been devised in consultation with local stakeholders. And this is key. It's key to understanding the local context and also local priorities. It's not for us to go in and force upon an area these benefits that we think are best. it's imperative that we understand what's going on the ground and involve as many local stakeholders as possible. This means that we identify conservation interventions that will actually work in the landscape, will actually deliver the gains that we're anticipating and result in additionality. So it's those benefits that wouldn't exist without the project, but it's also not duplicating effort already on the ground by, for example, government bodies or non-governmental organizations, or replacing those activities and the money that would have been used being diverted elsewhere. And it's very much through these consultations and engagements, it's about providing the right biodiversity benefits in the right places. So if we look, oh, sorry, can you go back, John? Thank you very much. If we look at the slides on the right there, this is one project. It's a linear energy infrastructure project in East Africa that had the potential to affect chimpanzees. And if you look at the picture in the foreground there, you can see very distinct forest fragments. And the chimpanzees were using these are their kind of core areas. And occasionally they were popping out and using the agricultural mosaic outside of the forest, which was bringing them into contact with people, which is not great. And also, as John mentioned about fragmentation and barrier effects, it was stopping gene flow between these fragments. So we managed to route the project to avoid these key areas. We minimized impact by reducing the working width. There was a rapid restoration schedule for those sections that were anywhere near chimpanzee habitat. And then we started working on these enhancements and benefits. Thankfully, there's a very active NGO community in this area that has a lot of priorities and had already been engaging and working with local communities, so they were aware that some of these activities might take place. And even better, there was a national strategy for chimpanzees that we could align the measures with. But as I mentioned, understanding the local context, because that figure in the front there is what we found in 2022, but actually the screenshot in the background is the very same area, but 20 years prior. And if you can look at that, you can see all those wooded riparian corridors there, and those forest fragments are much more integrated into the landscape. They just don't exist anymore, which is what's curtailing movement. So part of the schemes going forward will be to replant and recreate some of those riparian corridors, facilitating movement through that landscape, increasing gene flow, and also hopefully creating these movement corridors in a way that will allow chimps to move through the landscape but not coming into contact with people, for both the benefit of people and chimpanzees. That was more quantitative measures. From a qualitative perspective, we're also investing in genetic studies to look at chimpanzee movements outside the forest, just how many chimpanzees are there, where are they moving, what are they using. And the project's also sponsoring a study to look at chimpanzee interactions with roads. As part of the infrastructure project, a lot of existing roads had to be upgraded. So we partnered with a local university that is looking at chimpanzee behaviors around road crossings. And those results, when it's all finalized, will be made available to any projects that want to work in the landscape that perhaps need to upgrade or create new roads, and where they have to take chimpanzees into consideration. Next slide, Jim. So this was a great project that we worked on in West Africa. It was a solar project, and it was an interesting one because it was a retrospective impact assessment for an existing solar facility, focusing specifically on chimpanzees again. The project had done baseline surveys, and there was the potential for chimpanzees to be present in the local landscape, but not confirmed. Then there were recommendations made for enhancements, but no evidence that anything else had been taken forward. And thankfully, we had a very good, engaged and progressive client that generally wanted to understand, now that this project was up and running, could there have potentially been impacts on chimpanzees? They really wanted to get a better handle on that. And likewise, the recommendations that hadn't yet been enforced or implemented, were they needed to start with? And if so, were they the correct measures, and were they enough for what the project might have caused? So it was an interesting one. We worked very closely with our social colleagues in RSK Africa. And what we devised in consultation with the lenders and the client was a different survey methodology whereby, yes, we did some standard biodiversity type surveys. We did habitat assessments and a bit of camera trapping and walkovers to look at the site and its immediate surrounds to see if it was suitable for chimps and where chimpanzees, if they're where they might be, and look for evidence. But as with all ecological surveys, this is only going to provide a snapshot. And obviously we're looking retrospectively. So we focused much more on community engagement, and the social team went round and interviewed 5 communities around the solar facility to get a much better historical context. And we had some great photo sheets of different primates, so we could all make sure we were talking about the same species. There's Geoffrey there pointing to a map showing the community locations relative to the solar facility, so everyone could get a great feel for what was going on, where they were in the landscape, and give us much more historical information going back decades of chimpanzee movements. So all this together, once we pieced it all together, the habitat assessments and all the community engagement work, what we could confirm was that, yes, there was a small number of chimpanzees in the wider landscape, but never actually seen on or around the project site, either from a kind of nesting perspective or a foraging. They didn't cross the road where the project was, and actually crossed much further east along an existing river corridor. So with everything together and all these, actually all the feedback from the community is very consistent. What we could devise was that, yes, chimpanzees were present in low numbers, but they were unlikely to have been affected by the project. Next slide, Jim. Okay, so given the findings, and again, we're trying to reiterate the involvement of local communities and stakeholders in this. We could recommend to the client that they were in chimpanzee habitat in the wider sense, but no, they didn't affect chimpanzees, and therefore there were no residual impacts, but the gains should be provided if they were going to comply with international lender standards. So again, we engaged with the communities to try and work out what would be best, and also looked at what measures had already been proposed in previous project documentation. And what we found was actually chimpanzees were much more abundant prior to the Civil War, and then since then their numbers have decreased. When they were more abundant, they were actually quite scary, and they were coming into contact with people a lot more, is what we heard. There was a lot more crop foraging, even coming into villages. But over the years, they've kind of reduced in number and kept themselves to themselves. And as such, they're tolerated by the local communities. They appreciate they're there, but they're not concerned by them. So we talked about on-site and off-site enhancements before. What we didn't want here was to implement a measure that perhaps could raise the chimpanzee population locally, which would then bring them into contact with people. So that would be at a detriment to people and the chimpanzees. And also previous measures put forward for the project, which are good and sound measures in practice, were things like setting up a compensation fund for crop foraging. But what the local community said was, nowadays chimps don't crop forage at all. So putting that money just in the pot to sit there for compensation wouldn't have benefited the chimpanzees. So putting that all together, we decided off-site or ex-situ measures were best. And to deliver those benefits, the project has engaged a local non-governmental organization focusing on Western chimps, and are now sponsoring 3 different kind of projects, which is great. They're improving our understanding of chimpanzee distribution in the wider landscape, educating school children about chimpanzees and their conservation importance, and also a project to reinforce the status of the chimpanzee as a national emblem. Thanks, John.
Brilliant, thanks, Simon. And I'll just pick up on the Africa point a little bit before we close, if that's okay, because I've been working also on a project in Africa and Uganda called Wildebeest, which is essentially a savanna restoration project. So it's a sort of scheme, the sort of positive project that large infrastructure projects can contribute to as in terms of offsetting their impacts. This is a fairly straightforward, can you tell that's an AI image? It gives an idea of what it's meant to look like. So you've got cattle and wildlife all kind of living together in a much more sustainable way, and much better for biodiversity. And really what this is all about is slightly pivoting the way that, that cattle are managed in the environment in Africa. At the moment, they're allowed to, in many cases, roam quite freely. That means they tend to just eat the nicest grass, leave what they don't like so much, the less palatable stuff. And what you're finding across Africa is that the large parts of the landscape are overgrazed, and then the rest of it is non-native scrub. And this is really bad for the future. It's bad for the productivity in the environment and for biodiversity. So this solution of using mob grazing just to move the animals around every 2 or 3 days means that each patch of grassland is left for a good 6 months to recover. And instead of being grazed down to the ground permanently, it has time to get up to about chest height or waist height, depending where you are. And so that is clearly buzzing with wildlife. It's sequestering carbon because you've got this kind of real dense increase in biomass. And of course, it's also sending roots down into the soil, so it's good for the soil. So the first part of the process is to turn that non-native scrub into biochar. So rather than burning it, which is happening at the moment, which again is pretty rubbish for the climate, we turn it into biochar, which then gets returned to the soil as carbon, but obviously inert, and that allows the grassland to then develop over time. Now, one of the key things here is there's a massive socio-economic benefit as well, which is a very key part of the project. So you're increasing the yield of cattle by about 3 times. This project derived from a guy that we know in South Africa who'd done this for 15 years on his land and was just kind of astonished at how the minor change in the way the land was managed led to a massive increase in his beef production, but also led to his land being absolutely buzzing with wildlife. So he's absolutely passionate about it and he's kind of leading the way. And our role in this as RSK is that we are measuring the biodiversity uplift in particular. So we're using remote sensing to map the habitats and how that changes over time. We're putting out acoustic detectors and camera traps. We're also looking at the carbon benefit by measuring changes in soil carbon over time, and we're delivering this biochar benefit. The removal of the non-native invasive species is not to be sniffed at. That is a massive impact in Africa at the moment. Lantana is just one of many shrub species that is toxic and is just taking over and needs to be basically removed, and so you can reinstate the natural habitat, which is what this is all about. And in Uganda, about 43% of the land is called the cattle corridor, and we're hoping to extend this over much of that area to really make a massive difference to the landscape. And if you're interested, you can look on the website, and hopefully this film that we made last year is going to be coming out pretty soon, which kind of explains the whole process. But the reason I'm mentioning it is that there are projects like this out there where you can offset the impacts of your big schemes by contributing to very cost-effective habitat restoration and with all the associated benefits I've just talked about. Right. I'm aware that we've gone a little bit further on, so I'm going to zip through the summary quickly. Transmission infrastructure is obviously required to deliver net zero, so that's good for the planet. So we're all in favour of what we're doing. However, it can have negative impacts if not done sensitively. So that's why we're encouraging people to think about the design, routing in particular, but also the mitigative design. And net gain policies, as they develop in the UK and around the world, will mean that transmission infrastructure will have the opportunity to really positively lead to an enhancement of biodiversity across the world. Now, in England, B&G does that, and we're very much hoping that B&G, for these nationally significant infrastructure projects becoming mandatory in May, is going to make a big difference. Could be could kind of supercharge habitat restoration in England in particular. But it's important to consider biodiversity implications from the outset. As I said, if you are a developer, you can reduce your offsetting burden by designing a scheme sensitively, building into your scheme habitat measures within the footprint. And this applies internationally. So we've talked about the international stuff that Simon's been doing, the Performance Standard 6, the Nature Repair Act in Australia, environmental and social governance and TNFD. All of these things are kind of sending us in the right direction, basically, encouraging people to invest their money in nature positive interventions. So final message, I guess, is that we can all do our bit through our work to deliver this reversal of biodiversity loss that is so clearly needed. But also, if we do it sensitively and cleverly, we can have a wide variety of other environmental and societal benefits at the same time. So that's kind of the message we're wanting to get across. Right, we only have about 5 minutes for questions, which is a pity. I'm sure we can go on a little bit longer. Katie will tell me if that's not allowed, but we'll try that. If you put your cameras on again, guys. Oops, where are we? Brilliant. Okay, so I do have a couple of questions to kick off with. First of all, Laura asked about sharing the slides. I'm sure we are able to share the slides. I can't actually see the answer there, but I'm sure we can. So for overhead lines, are the biodiversity impacts generally less than for other types of transmission projects? Yes, I showed that rather gruesome picture of a stalk on an overhead line, but really in terms of the impacts on habitats, the footprint, as you can see on the towers here, the footprint is really quite small. So they can kind of sail over the environment with relatively low impacts. So it's, whilst they can be quite controversial in terms of visual impact for people, certainly in terms of the environmental impacts, they are quite low. And it's really just bird strike that is the main impact. This one might be more for you, Catherine, or I can answer it too. What are the implications for National Grid of NSIPs becoming mandatory? So for the company itself.
Yeah, so I think for Grid, because they've already got their internal 10% target, it's not necessarily going to fundamentally change things that they're currently considering. But obviously they have a lot of development that is occurring, so there's going to be a large-scale unit requirements. I think the main thing will be that, well, if it becomes mandatory for NSIPs, there's going to be a more consistent framework on which those units can be delivered. And exactly what that's going to look like, I think, is the current question. There was a consultation about BNG for NSIPs last year, which introduced a couple of possible variations from the standard BNG process. So things like what is considered temporary for BNG and whether that's an elongated period of time for an NSIP given the typically longer duration of development, and also how that baseline value is calculated at present, because order limits for these long linear schemes can be incredibly large, but actually only a comparatively small proportion of it is impacted. They kind of get penalised for something that is outside of their control. So there is the potential, from what's been indicated in that consultation document, that there may be changes to the actual area that needs to be considered when assessing the baseline, which has a knock-on effect to what 10% might equal. But we haven't had an awful lot more clear guidance on what we're actually going to see. So it's
no, I did see a response where they were looking at that. I've got the sense of National Grid, the government, were looking at that in terms of the guidance for NSIPs, and that is positive. It's certainly something that we recommended because it seemed really unfairly punitive to have your baseline being the whole footprint within the order limits, which is a very wide area, especially over 180 kilometres or whatever it might be. So that is disproportionately unfair. I've noticed actually there's a question from John Harris from Anglian Water, who's making the same point. So it says here, current requirements for linear schemes can result in disproportionately high BNG obligations because they are calculated using the full red line boundary rather than the actual ecological impact. While this issue may be partly addressed once the new NSIP guidelines are released, how have you worked to align BNG requirements more proportionally with the true ecological impacts of a project, particularly for schemes outside the NSIP regime and determined under the Town and Country Planning Act? In particular, have you found effective approaches through early engagement with DEFRA and Natural England planning authorities to agree an impact-led interpretation of BNG rather than relying solely on the red line boundary? Yes, is how I'd answer that. I mean, I've always said that the statutory biodiversity metric is meant to be a tool to help us make the right decisions. It's not a hard and fast, you absolutely have to stick to this. So we always through our discussions with local authorities and with Natural England and with whoever, we're trying to find the right outcome for biodiversity. And if things are skewed and unfair because of the kind of the policy situation as it stands, we're very much open to having those kind of pragmatic discussions with the regulatory bodies. Right, Catherine, I don't know if you've got anything else to add to that.
No, I think
Ooh,
you've covered that well.
I've gone and lost my questions. Wait a minute. Oh no, I've completely lost my questions. That's a disaster. Wait a minute. Have you got your questions, you guys?
Yes, I got them here.
Oh, hold on. Here we are. Here we are. Here we are. No, they've come up here. Phew. Well, you can ask one. Go for it.
Oh, no problem. So I think we've got one here from Claire EDP saying, how can you apply BNG to new overhead lines when the red line boundary is more difficult to define and future management on grantor land is difficult to enforce? So I think this is, yeah, it's a very good question. I think with overhead lines, it's obviously not necessarily just that footprint of those pylons, although obviously you can assess that, and you can look at the way in which you are either installing or replacing the overhead lines themselves and make a judgment call on the scale of impact that that particular activity may have, if any. It's also having to consider things like your access routes and your working areas, your compounds, etc., all of which would need to be accounted for. In terms of that offset element and that future management on grantor land, it is a key issue for NSIPs, particularly within the energy transmission sector, where you don't necessarily have that ownership or control over what happens on that land. And I think we would hope we would see something within the NSIP requirements for BNG when they come through that would address that, because having those individual agreements with each individual landowner are just not feasible in the majority of cases. I think there, if you've got work that has areas of land that you do own associated with it, so if, for example, you're doing overhead line work that is tied to substation builds or expansions, then that's where perhaps you can maximise what you can achieve on site. And then it's probably a case of most feasibly working with an off-site location for some of those residual impacts, unless, of course, you have got a landowner who is particularly keen. So reaching out to landowners to see where they may have interest in being involved in that process would always be an option. Sorry, Jon, if you've got anything to add there.
No, that's fine. That covers it off. I'm just looking at the time. We've got another question. I think we'll get to one more, which is to do with detecting carcasses under overhead lines can take an awful lot of effort, and I think that's it's not what we deal with in BNG, but it is what we deal with in understanding the ecological impacts. I remember when I was younger having to look for bat carcasses alongside a road scheme, and my goodness, it is a needle in a haystack, and it's kind of disproportionately large amount of effort for understanding those impacts. So Deborah, I get your point. I think there are probably those clever ways that Catherine was talking about for kind of detecting impacts. There's things like drones. There may well be other ways of doing that more cost effectively than actually having to go out and look for carcasses. I'm sure there must be a lot of work being done for wind farms under turbines. Catherine, Simon, I don't know if either of you have encountered much of that, but it is an issue for a lot of energy schemes, the kind of those impacts on birds and the like.
Yeah, I think sort of working with dogs and sniffer dog training is probably one of the key areas that's been used at the moment for wind farms, particularly with bats. The extent to which they've spread that out to bird carcasses, I'm not entirely sure about, but I wouldn't be surprised if that is being used.
That would make a lot of sense. Yeah. Okay. Well, look, I think we'll leave it there since we've gone over a little bit. Just to thank Catherine and Simon very much for joining me today. Thank you to everyone who's dialed in. There will be plenty more events in the Creating a Buzz RSK Energy campaign, so do please look out for what's coming on social media. Thank you very much for your time, and we will respond to any other questions that are popping in as I speak. We'll commit to answering those online later, if that's okay. Anyway, thank you very much for your time, and enjoy the rest of your day.